In early September of 2021, a huge swarm of monarch butterflies descended on the small town of Lead, South Dakota. There were so many butterflies that they painted the ground orange and completely covered the town's fire truck. It was a beautiful sight to behold, but also quite the mystery. You see, normally monarchs don't hang out in the northern plains states at that time of year. They typically spend their days migrating south for the winter. So what caused this bizarre butterfly behavior? Hi, I'm here, and this is my channel. This is the story of an unusual animal migration and the scientists who raced against the clock to uncover its cause. Every year, millions of monarch butterflies migrate from Canada, the US, and Mexico back to their overwintering grounds in central Mexico and parts of California. The eastern population spends the winter clustered together in Mexico's Sierra de los Himalayas mountains, where they stay warm during the day by huddling together and then cool off at night with evaporative cooling, basically sweating. This behavior allows them to survive for months until it's time to head north again. The western population, which breeds along the west coast, doesn't really do this. Instead, they fly up to 300 miles each way every day to forage and just kind of chill out in large groups the rest of the time. In late summer and early fall, the eastern and western populations meet up in the middle and continue migrating west together toward their shared overwintering sites. But exactly how they navigate hundreds or even thousands of miles each year is still a bit of a mystery. We know that they rely on visual landmarks like mountain ranges and coastlines to help them get from point A to point B, and we think they use the sun's position in the sky as well as Earth's magnetic field to orient themselves. Monarchs can't read maps, but these tools combined probably help them keep their bearings. We also know that monarchs travel primarily during the day. That's partly because they need to conserve energy and partly because they're toxic, so they don't want to be out flying around when predators are most active. And finally, we know that monarchs tend to fly between 10 and 30 miles per hour, which means a migration that covers several hundred miles can take several days. But while we've learned a lot about monarchs over the years, that doesn't mean we understand everything about their migratory patterns. In fact, there are still a lot of gaps in our knowledge. Like, we know that monarchs often stop to refuel along their migratory route, but we don't know exactly where they're stopping or why. And although we know that monarchs move south in the fall, we don't know if they all take the same route every year, or if they can somehow sense when the conditions are best for flying long distances. Which brings us back to that bizarre incident in Lead, South Dakota in 2021. On September, local residents started noticing huge numbers of monarchs fluttering around town. At first, only a few hundred had shown up, but their numbers quickly grew into the thousands, eventually covering entire trees and telephone lines. It looked amazing, but it was also super weird. The town sits about 600 miles north of the Rocky Mountains, far from the monarch's typical migratory corridor. And since monarchs usually travel during the day, the townspeople didn't see them massing until sunset, when they congregated on trees in massive numbers. By the time the sun came up the next morning, most of the monarchs were gone. But after a few days of surveying the scene, researchers realized that something strange was going on here. See, monarchs typically leave their overwintering grounds in late February or early March, and they head north pretty much straight away. They reach their summer breeding grounds in Canada and the northern US by June, and then they stay there all summer doing what butterflies do. In late summer, they start heading south again. So it was already mid-September by the time monarchs would normally start showing up in South Dakota. What's more, the monarchs spotted in Lead weren't the normal eastern population. Genetic testing revealed that they actually belong to the western population, which doesn't normally come this far east. So why did all these monarchs show up in Lead, South Dakota in early September 2021? One possibility was that they were all headed to the same overwintering site and just happened to stop in Lead for a little R&R. But other researchers thought something else might be going on. They wondered if maybe the monarchs weren't just stopping in Lead, but actually overwintering there. Monarch butterfly overwintering sites are typically located in areas with mild temperatures, lots of trees for huddling and plenty of milkweed, the plant that monarchs lay their eggs on. Milkweed is also the only plant that monarch caterpillars will eat, so it's essential for their survival. And although South Dakota isn't exactly known for its clement weather, there is a patch of milkweed growing along the Missouri River not too far from Lead. So maybe, just maybe, the monarchs were making use of it. To test this idea, researchers set up a tent near the river to monitor the monarchs through the winter. Every morning they counted the number of dead and alive butterflies, recorded the daily maximum temperature, and collected data about wind speed and direction. Now, it's not exactly fun spending your winter in a tent, especially when it's in South Dakota. So after 3 months, the researchers packed up their things and headed home. But fortunately, some of their equipment stayed in the tent with the monarchs. And when they checked back in the following spring, the data showed that the monarchs had overwintered there just fine. Not only that, but they had survived in good numbers. The count was down to 2,000 individuals from an estimated peak of 40,000. But 2,000 is still a lot of monarchs. And the researchers had proof that monarchs were overwintering in South Dakota for the first time ever. But why? Was this just a one-off situation or something more? To find out, researchers started monitoring the monarchs' overwintering site every month, starting in October 2021. They wanted to see if the conditions in Lead changed over time and potentially influenced the monarchs' behavior. In the meantime, another team of researchers was combing through climate data to see if they could shed light on what was going on. They collected records of temperature and precipitation from the National Centers for Environmental Information and used those to calculate Lead's average monthly temperature and compare it to other monarch overwintering sites. They found that although Lead was typically colder than the other sites, the difference wasn't huge. For example, December and January are usually about 10 degrees Fahrenheit colder in Lead than in the southernmost parts of their range. But recent years have seen larger and more frequent temperature swings across North America, including in Lead, and those changes seem to have made overwintering in South Dakota more tenable for monarchs. The team in the field was also finding evidence that monarchs were increasingly spending the winter in Lead. In 2021, they saw monarchs huddling together for warmth on particularly cold days. And in 2022, they saw fewer dead butterflies than expected after a major snowstorm, suggesting that the monarchs had huddled up and used their collective body heat to stay alive. And finally, they started getting reports from local residents who regularly sent them photos of monarchs they spotted in their own backyards throughout the winter. All of this data taken together pointed toward the same conclusion. The monarchs weren't just stopping in Lead anymore, they were staying there to overwinter. At the moment, it seems like this is just happening in Lead and nowhere else in South Dakota, and we don't know if this new overwintering site will stick around for very long. As climate change continues to cause big swings in temperature, it's possible that Lead will become a hospitable place for monarchs to spend the winter. Or maybe this was just a one-off occurrence and we'll never see it happen again. Either way, though, this discovery highlights just how much we still have to learn about the natural world around us. You never know what you're going to find if you just take the time to look. Monarch butterflies are just one of many creatures that undertake epic journeys every year. To learn more about some truly awe-inspiring migrations, check out this playlist. And thanks for watching.